The committee will come to order. Chairman Miller has a scheduling conflict for the opening of this meeting and perhaps more of it than that, and he has asked me to step in and chair the meeting until such time as he gets here. By the way, for what it's worth, today is Chairman Miller's birthday, so when you see him, you might want to give him a hearty congratulations on being 49 plus 1 or 2. Before we begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent for our colleagues Charles Bastani from Louisiana and Randy Nagelbauer from Texas to sit at the dais and participate in today's proceedings when they get here. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good morning and welcome to today's full committee hearing, assessing VA's capital investment options to provide veterans care. As today is National Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Awareness Day, I would like to take a brief moment to address those veterans experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder who may be in attendance or listening. Hope and healing are possible, and I encourage you and all of those suffering to reach out for help. You can call 1-800-273-TALK, that's 1-800-273-8255, and press 1 for veterans. Now, turning our attention to what we are gathered here today to discuss, the potential for a new paradigm of care for our veterans through the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA's capital investment programs. As many of you know, when this committee was considering legislation to authorize VA's major medical facility projects and leases last year, the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO as we call it here, raised concerns about how to properly account for VA's lease authorizations. CBO, after soliciting and receiving additional information from VA about the lease contracts, determined that such leases should be classified as capital leases rather than as operating leases, as CBO had done in the past. This new scoring criteria resulted in new challenges to our ability to authorize VA's leases, as under CBO's new scoring construct, they now constitute significant direct spending costs that must be offset under statutory pay-go requirements and House and Senate budget rules. For the 27 pending leases, that means finding more than $2.3 billion in upfront savings from other government programs. This issue isn't one of politics or party, nor is it one that pits one body of Congress or one branch of government against another. Rather, this is an issue that all of us who are tasked with providing high-quality care and services for our veterans are facing together. And it is one that will take our collective effort to resolve. VA has proposed 27 major medical facility leases, most of them for community-based outpatient clinics in the current budget. Of these, 21 are expansions or consolidations of existing lease facilities, and 6 are new leases. Let me be clear. The needs of our veterans in those areas are going to be met, but how those needs will be met in light of CBO's reclassification of VA's lease authorization request is what we will discuss today. Information VA has circulated to members of Congress about the status of the pending lease request includes a statement that says, I quote, "Until last year, enactment of these leases has been a fairly routine annual exercise," unquote. I do not take that as a compliment, and neither should the department. Expending our hard-working taxpayer dollars on authorizing costly capital investment projects should never be a matter of routine. Rather, it should be a responsibility that is taken seriously, evaluated carefully, and scrutinized constantly to ensure that the capital investments we are undertaking are expanding our veterans' access to care and not just expanding VA's bureaucratic reach. Last year, Chairman Miller committed to working closely with VA, CBO, and our colleagues in the Senate to find a way forward for VA's major medical facility lease program to provide high-quality care and services for our veterans. That commitment remains today for Mr. Chairman Miller as well as the rest of this committee. However, we can no longer afford to invest our time arguing about the merits of CBO scoring determinations. That does not get our veterans closer to the care they need, which is the goal that we all share and that we must achieve. Absent a way forward to either adhere to CBO's ruling and pay for these leases or collectively decide to waive our budget rules, we must take a hard look outside the box to assess our options for developing these projects. Those options include new constructs for public-private partnerships, joint collaborations, and other avenues of care. That is what I look forward to discussing here today. I now yield to our ranking member, Mr. Michaud, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this very important hearing today. Ensuring that the Department of Veterans Affairs has the proper infrastructure and facilities to provide safe, effective, quality health care to our veterans, it is a priority of mine and a priority of this committee to make sure that that happens. Some of the ways in which VA provides this care is through construction programs, sharing agreements, collaboration, and other federal agency and leasing authority. This is an important hearing and an important step in our ongoing discussion regarding how we can best meet these infrastructure and facility needs of the VA this year and in the years and decades to come. The VA has an ever-increasing backlog of construction requests. Along with this backlog, they are facing an environment of constrained federal spending and uncertainty regarding where our veterans will live and how, in the decades to follow, will medicine be provided to our veterans. The VA has an inventory of many facilities that are over 50 years old and that were built to provide medicine in a way that it was provided following World War II. We must ensure that the facilities we build today will meet the needs of the future and that we build or acquire them at a reasonable cost. One way VA meets its infrastructure needs today is through seeking authorization for major medical facility leases as required in statutes. In the light of recent events regarding a change in the way that the Congressional Budget Office treats VA medical facility lease authority for scoring purposes, the time has come to look for alternative solution. This hearing is an important step to begin that discussion. Last year, the CBO has determined that VA leases were similar to contracts for acquiring facilities and thus a form of third-party financing as compared to operating leases. CBO's decision decided that in the views that this third-party finances was equivalent to a government purchase of the asset, and therefore the cost should be recorded up front as compared to spread out annually over the duration of the lease, as in the practices of operating leases and how VA medical facilities lease requires were scored in the past. For 20 years, CBO has been scoring VA's facility leases as operating leases. However, in preparing the cost estimate for the construction authorization for fiscal year 2012, CBO received additional information from VA that caused CBO to determine that facility leases were executed more like capital leases, and therefore the cost of these leases should be recorded upfront for budgetary purposes. This determination led to CBO's score of $1.2 billion in direct spending for the leases originally contained in the fiscal year 2012 construction bill. Because offsets could not be found for the leases were stripped out of that bill. For over a year now, we have been unable to come to a solution or put forth alternative ideas to solve this problem. In all honesty, it has been disappointing, and I hope that this hearing will provide some open discussions from all parties involved. I'd like to hear from our witnesses today whether there was a change in VA's policy regarding the types of leases it's undertaking. I want to hear from both panels on what they have done together to try to solve this issue. Is it a matter of disagreeing on definitions or terms, or does it need a legislative fix to solve the problem? As VA looked at alternatives, ways besides the major medical facility lease program as it is currently operating to provide services to our veterans. I have many more questions without answers. What I do know is if we don't find a way forward, over 340,000 veterans in 20 states could be negatively affected by this. That is simply unacceptable, and we must find a way forward. In short, I'd like to learn from our witnesses where we go from here, not just in terms of VA's medical facility lease program, but where do we go from here in terms of providing the infrastructure needed to provide a world-class healthcare system for our veterans this year and 20 years from now. So I look forward to hearing the witnesses today, and I want to thank all the panelists today as well. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Michaud. I would now like to welcome our first panel to the witness table. With us today from the CBO is Mr. Robert A. Sunshine, the Deputy Director of that organization. Sir, thank you for being here today. You may now proceed with your testimony. We have 5 minutes allotted for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Congressman Michoud, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the budgetary treatment of VA's leases of medical facilities. I should note that veterans medical centers are important to our nation and to our veterans, and we're not questioning their value or their importance. What our job is to address, is how transactions are treated in the budget. And that's what I'll talk about today. So let me begin by describing CBO's role in the process. Our job is to provide the Congress with the best possible information about the nature and magnitude of the government's financial commitments that would result from any particular legislative proposal. CBO does not determine what kinds of purchases agencies can make or what kinds of leases they may enter into, nor does CBO determine how agencies record those transactions in their budgets. That's up to the agencies and the Office of Management and Budget. Our job is to score legislation. How do we analyze proposed purchases or leases of property? CBO assesses the government's financial commitment by taking into account both the form and the substance of the transaction. We do that because over the years we have encountered a number of transactions that were structured to appear one way, but fundamentally were something very different. The most vivid example that I recall occurred several years ago when the Air Force wanted to replace the aging fleet of tanker aircraft that it uses to refuel other aircraft in the air. It presented a very complicated financial plan whereby Boeing would build the aircraft to the government specifications and the Air Force would rent them for 20 years. CBO determined that under that plan, the Air Force was essentially buying the aircraft, but in a way that it hoped would avoid the need for a large upfront appropriation to pay for them. That plan was also more expensive than a straightforward purchase would have been. That was an example of what we call third-party financing. That is, rather than using its resources to acquire a capital asset, the government structures a transaction so that a private entity borrows the money to build the asset, and the government, through a stream of future payments, pays off most or all of that debt. My written statement describes other examples of such financing, including energy savings performance contracts, enhanced use leases, leaseback ventures, and military housing privatization. Although projects that use third-party financing employ a variety of contractual arrangements and can result in the acquisition of many kinds of assets, they generally have several features in common. In most cases, the government initiates the project, selects the developer, and specifies the project's parameters. It has significant economic interest and retains substantial control, and it serves as the sole or primary source of capital backing of the project's financing. By seeking to spread acquisition costs over many years, those transactions aim to achieve a budgetary treatment that is at odds with the established principles of federal budgeting, which require agencies to record the costs of government investments when they are made. Under that treatment, third-party arrangements may be subject to less scrutiny in the appropriation process, and they may skew decisions about how to allocate budgetary resources by giving preferential treatment to investment projects on the basis of how they're financed rather than on their merits. Moreover, because private entities pay more to borrow than the government does, third-party financing is more expensive than straightforward government financing. Although VA classifies its leases of medical facilities as operating leases, most of them, in CBO's judgment, are akin to government purchases of facilities built specifically for VA's use. But instead of being financed by the Treasury, they rely on third-party financing. These leases have many of the following key features that lead to that conclusion. They're designed and constructed at the government's request. The contractual agreements are long-term and match the private partner's financing instrument for constructing the facility. The federal government commits to make fixed annual payments sufficient to service much or all of the debt incurred to construct the facility. And payments for the federal government are the only or the primary source of income for facilities and are sufficient to retire most or all of the debt over the life of the lease. Entering into an operating lease is similar to renting an apartment. A renter can move out after a short period with no further commitment. But VA's build-to-lease contracts are similar to obtaining a mortgage to buy a house. The agency acquires an asset along with a liability to pay for it, but then gives it back after it has paid for it. Because those transactions are essentially governmental purchases, CBO has determined that budget authority for most leases of VA medical facilities should be recorded upfront when leases are initiated in amounts equal to the development and construction costs of the facilities. That is, the cost should be recorded when the acquisition occurs, when the government is actually buying a facility, as is done for most other purchases that the government makes, not when the debt is repaid. Thank you again for the opportunity to explain our analysis, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Excuse me. What would need to change about how VA contracts for build-to-suit medical facility leases for CBO to consider them operating leases rather than capital leases?
I think the key question is the facility being built for the government and largely paid for by the government? If the facility is being built for general, such that the government is maybe committing for 3 years or 5 years, and the builder may then the government may or may not renew it, and the builder is at risk for who may occupy the building after that. I mean, that's just like if the government enters into a lease for an office, very general office space for a few years. The government's not on the hook for that space. And I think the key question is the space being built for the government, and is the government essentially paying for it by the commitment that it makes up front? If it's not paying for it by the commitment that it makes up front, then that's I think a different situation.
I see.
The question is, can you get someone to build it when the government's only on the hook for 3 years or 5 years or something like that?
As I understand it, CBO's scoring VA's 20-year leases as capital leases is based on the assumption that these lease agreements will extinguish the full debt of the third-party developer builder during the lease term of the clinic. But some developers have also said that that's not necessarily the case. Now, if in such a situation, if CBO were provided with information that the debt is not retired in full by the VA lease payments on that development project, would this affect how CBO scores that arrangement?
I think the question is not whether the debt is 100% or 99%. The question is the government is paying for most or all of the building. I think, and we haven't defined some specific cutoff point. If the government's paying for 30% of the building, I think that's very different from when the government's paying for 90 or 100% of the building.
Okay. Please respond to the statement that came from the Office of Management and Budget that they put in a letter to Senator Mary Landrieu that says, and I quote, "In contrast to CBO, OMB does not score the legislative authorization of leases with a pay-go budgetary cost. Instead, OMB's view is that authorization bill is like any other authorization that must be funded through separate legislation before the agency can use the leasing authority. In the cases of leases for VA medical facilities, the funding will be provided in annual appropriations bills," unquote.
I think the problem that has been created that you're facing is that the law requires congressional approval of leases that involve payments of more than $1 million a year. And the authorization of those leases creates the authority for the agency to enter into them. And the way they're being treated, they actually enter into them without sufficient appropriations to cover them. They don't have 20 years worth of appropriations. They don't have the appropriations to cover, that's the problem. They don't have the appropriations to cover the cost of the facility, which is why we're scoring the legislation approving the leases as creating contract authority, giving them the authority to making that financial commitment, which is actually not being charged against appropriations because they don't have sufficient appropriations to do it.
And I've got one final question in my allotted time. VA major medical facility, community-based outpatient clinics, leases can fall into several categories. One being a contracted CBOC where the space and the staff are not VA personnel. Does the CBO's current scoring impact of these existing privatized CBOCs or VA's ability to use service arrangements for future privatized facilities? Can you explain that?
I think if I understand correctly, the agency has the authority now to enter into service contracts, and they're doing some of that. And in fact, if there's no legislation required for them to do that, then we're not involved. Because our job is to estimate the impact of legislation. And if they have the authority to do it without legislation, then there's no role for us to play. And if there were legislation needed, we'd have to look at that and think about what consequences that have. But I think a service contract is very different from a building of a building.
Okay, thank you. I now yield Mr. Michaud 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Sunshine, for being here this morning. For budgetary scoring purposes, would CBO treat a mixed-use facility such as when VHA and VBA co-locate in the same building? How would you treat?
I mean, mixed use by multiple government agencies?
Yes.
I think the fact that I don't think that would make any difference. The fact that they were as long as it's all the government, I think that's what we would look at.
So you would not treat that differently?
No.
Okay. I'd like to follow up also on the similar letter, well, the same letter that the chairman mentioned from Senator Landrieu and Representative Bastani. That was sent to the Congressional Services. What the CRS said that if Congress effectively leaves it to the Office of Management and Budget to determine the cost of the legislation, and OMB determines that the legislation does not increase direct spending, then no budgetary effects would be recorded on the PAYGO scorecard. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, there are multiple rules that you're grappling with. One is the statutory PAYGO scorecard, and OMB determines, unless directed otherwise by the Congress, what goes on that scorecard. There are also congressional PAYGO rules that, in general, the budget committees rely on us for the scoring. So yes, the statutory PAYGO would depend on how OMB scores things. Congressional budget enforcement generally relies on CBO's estimates.
So that statement then is accurate then?
Yes, I believe it, yes.
Okay. Can you, after 20 years of scoring VA medical, major medical facility leases as operating leases, can you explain the difference in what you looked at during preparation for the scoring for the fiscal year 2012 construction facility lease as opposed to prior years? What was the difference?
Sure. I looked at an estimate that we wrote, I think, in 2004 and 2005, and basically, and we said, well, we're estimating, we're assuming these are operating leases, but we're not quite sure what they're like. I mean, agencies don't send us their leases. They don't ask us to approve them or review them. So in the course of doing the bill in 2012, we actually started learning things that we didn't know before. And we learned, and we actually have seen copies of the lease agreements, and some of the contracts that have been entered into. So we learned a lot that we didn't know. And I mean, we should have known it earlier, and we should have informed the Congress earlier about the nature of these transactions, but we didn't. And we got much more information last year, and that caused us to rethink how we should treat these in our estimates.
You said much more information you got last year. What is that much more information?
Well, we got information mostly from VA about the nature of the leases. Then we actually have some of the specific lease contracts and some of the agreements with builders and some of the actual documents that are involved in these transactions.
Okay.
And we had not seen those before, because that's not a routine kind of thing that we would ordinarily have.
Can you explain the difference between special purpose improvements and special purpose assets?
No. I'm sorry.
And so you don't know where those definitions come from, and
No, I'm not familiar. Those terms are not terms that I'm familiar with.
do the Department of Veterans Affairs and the CBO, when you look at, you said you got more information that determined why you made a different decision that you did. Have you worked with the VHA or the department to try to work out the differences in the leases? Language so that would not have to be scored up front?
I think we've gotten information from the department as to how the leases work. I don't know that they may have asked our staff questions about how they could change them, but I don't know that for sure.
So it could be the reason why you're doing it differently this time around is because your agency saw more information and the definitions might, you're interpreting a little bit differently because you saw that information?
Yes, we got a lot more information last year than we had previously had about how many of these leases are structured, and we had not known that before.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Benachek, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. People enter into leases for a lot of different reasons, and I don't understand how you can just say that a lease is the same as a purchase. I mean, I don't understand it's not the same as a purchase. I mean, people conduct leases all the time that they end up paying for the construction of the building. Otherwise, the building would never get built. It happens in the private sector, all the time. A build-to-suit situation. So I just don't understand why that you would treat this as a purchase. Can you explain that to me and maybe a little bit, make it easier for me to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I guess our view is...
You don't end up with the property at the end, so it's not a purchase. You keep calling it a purchase. This is essentially a purchase, but it's not a purchase. It's a lease. There's a difference.
But essentially, the government is specifying where it wants the building, what kind of building it wants, and it's paying for most or all of it by entering into a long-term commitment. And we view that as fundamentally equivalent to a purchase. It's not structured like a purchase. It doesn't look like a purchase. And again, I mean, we could wind up with it at the end or not wind up with it at the end. But from our perspective, it's almost the same thing as the government building the building itself, except we're paying someone else to do it, and someone else is borrowing the money, and we're paying it off over time.
Let me ask you.
I mean, if we were only paying for 20% or 30% or leasing it for 5 years, I think that would be a whole different thing, as opposed to a really long-term lease where we're basically paying for most or all of the cost of building the building.
Well, your argument to me doesn't hold any water at all. Okay, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. I can understand your argument of saying there's not appropriations for the 20 years of lease. Okay, that argument I can accept, but the fact that you just seem to be able to have the authority to call it a purchase when it's not, I don't see how you give that any authority. When the federal government leases a building, does that property owner pay local taxes?
I assume so.
Does the government pay local taxes when they own the building?
I don't think so.
That's what my thoughts are as well. So taking property off the local tax roll is a significant issue, I think, in many small communities where these CBOCs are, because I got them in my communities. And, they're all upset with federal land in their communities that don't pay any taxes to support their schools and that. The other thing is that when the government builds something, I don't know that they manage it the same as somebody else building something and then leasing it to the government. I think that the overall cost of the lease is actually much less than the overall cost of the purchase. Have you done any actual comparisons of similar things in your analysis?
I think our staff thinks that the additional costs, both in terms of financing and various fees that are associated with these private sector kinds of transactions, are greater, in some cases noticeably greater,
construction management
than if the government just went and built it. Now, the government doesn't always build things so well, obviously.
That is my impression, is that federal government construction costs are, head and shoulders above private sector construction costs. And it would be my thought that the lease is overall much cheaper for the government and provides a local tax base for the local community as well. And, and it seems to me that you have an argument here that argues the opposite way without any evidence of that.
I think, our concern is making sure that the nature of the government's commitment is accurately reflected in the budget, and whether the government should be leasing things or buying things is a choice that the Congress and the agencies should make based on their best analysis of the details that we can't get into on a building by building basis.
I understand that argument.
Our objective is just to try to capture in the budget numbers the nature of the government's commitment.
Right. Well, that portion that you said, the money is not appropriated for the 20 years. I mean, that is a valid argument. But if the money is appropriated, for example, to hire you, the money to keep you on staff for the next 10 years is not appropriated at this time. That's not a good argument to me. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. O'Rourke, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also find the decision that the CBO has made frustrating and inconvenient, especially for the constituents I represent. We have nearly 80,000 veterans. We're not served by a full-service medical facility, which means many of them have to travel 10 hours round trip to Albuquerque, New Mexico to receive treatment. And the decision the CBO has made narrows our options. But having said that, it's hard for me to argue with the logic behind the conclusion that you've reached. I can understand that. And I think that we have to be honest with ourselves about the purchases and obligations that we make. We have to be honest with the taxpayer, and we have to be consistent in the rulings and how we score these things for all agencies and departments. And so my first question is, and you hit on this in your opening statements, is this how we score every facility lease or purchase across every department and agency in the federal government, DOD, HHS, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, for the most part, agencies don't need legislative authorization to enter into leases, which is, I think, an unusual factor that relates to VA. But in terms of how things are recorded in the budget, the answer is yes. And the Circular A11 that governs, OMB Circular A11 that governs how these kinds of things are treated in the budget specifies that the cost of capital leases and, in fact, the cost of operating leases that are multi-year are supposed to be charged upfront in the budget in the year that the commitment is made. So when we build dams or roads or prisons or space shuttles or aircraft carriers, yes, the funding is required upfront in order to pay for them.
And you said, for the most part, other agencies and departments don't require legislation for these kind of capital investments, these facility investments, except for the most part. What are those agencies or departments that have?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone here knows. I'm not sure there's any other situation where we are involved in assessing legislation that authorizes leases. There may be, but I'm not aware of it. It's pretty unusual.
Okay. And then to ask another scenario based on this decision, if there is a third party, say a private hospital or another public entity hospital at some other level of government that has space and leases that space to the federal government, that space was not constructed with the specific intent of providing that space for the VA, that would be treated as an operating lease under this logic
Yeah, that sounds to me, if it were for a few years and spaces already exists, yes.
and is there a time limit? What if the lease is for 20 years, to use the example that we've been using today?
I'm not sure that there are limits on the length of leases that agencies can enter into. I think for the most part, I think operating leases are not supposed to be more than 5 years. I'm not a complete expert in all these rules, but I think if they were for 3 years or 5 years or something like that, that would be generally considered an operating lease.
And I saw you looking back to your staff to see if there were other comparable agencies or departments or scenarios like the one that we're talking about with the VA. I'd like to follow up with you and your office and explore different scenarios based on this ruling, assuming it stands, to find out how we get the job done for El Paso and communities like ours that desperately need these facilities and need to be creative and innovative in how they finance and construct them. And with our options now being limited, it really means that we've got to be creative and fully understand how these kinds of rulings are applied across all federal departments or agencies. So look forward to your responsiveness to those questions as they come forward.
We would be delighted to work with the committee to try and figure out ways to address the issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Holzkamp, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sunshine, just a couple questions. You do make reference to the requirement of specific authorization for leases in excess of $1 million. Any of these that we've been provided by the committee, do they exceed that $1 million per year lease ceiling?
The leases that were being proposed, I believe, at least many of them do.
Many of them do.
Yeah.
Many of them do. Okay. And curious as well, do you have that, and I'm sure the department does, do you have information on the cost per square foot on these leases? Do you all see that?
No, I don't have that. I'm sure the department can give you that.
All right. And more specifically, I do understand, as my colleague has indicated, the issues here, I think, as far as accounting and the budget and requirements for transparency and obligations. And what is the solution here? What would you recommend Congress do as a solution here?
Or CBO is not supposed to make recommendations, but I mean, the options are limited in terms. I mean, one way is, okay, we fund these things the way we fund other construction in the government. We provide however much money we need to build whatever it is that we want, and we make the trade-offs between those costs and other costs in the budget. It's, we have the caps on discretionary funding, and the Congress has to make the trade-offs between different things. And so one option is, all right, these are important. We'll have to provide funding for them, and we'll have to have less funding for something else. That's one. So another solution is, I think the service contract idea, which I've seen may be an option that works. And I think that may in fact not even require legislation. And if there are ways to enter into actual, real short-term operating leases, that's another way to approach it.
Mm-hmm. So aside from your thoughts that perhaps this approach for the department was more expensive than other alternatives, simply approving them in a similar manner and that we do in most other departments would solve the problem for the CBO?
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason that there's an issue is simply because these are being funded and arranged in ways that are different than the way other construction projects are generally done. In general, the government goes out and builds things or buys things, and it pays for them. And the appropriation committees provide the money to do that. This is a different kind of arrangement, and the way it's been working is the appropriators actually haven't been providing the money up front to do it.
And if I understood your comments earlier, this is unusual in terms of other agencies across the federal government?
Yeah, I mean, in our written statement, we've noted that there are a number of other occasions where we've encountered proposals for third-party financing, but it's not widespread.
Mm-hmm. Are there other agencies you would say that you know of that are using this as well, or is this the only one that is significant?
I don't know that we're aware of that there are lots of other things like this around.
Okay, all right, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Negrete McLeod, you're recognized for 5 minutes. No questions? Okay. Mr. Bilirakis, I believe you're next. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Sunshine, for coming and testifying. And I appreciate the CBO's thorough explanation of the recent changes regarding VA leases. Could you address, I know this was touched upon, but it's worth asking again, could you address why CBO has decided now to change the way they score the VA leases? And what was the catalyst for this reexamination?
Well, the catalyst was when we were working on the authorizing legislation last year, and we asked, perhaps more than we had asked before, about the details of what kinds of leases the VA was entering into. And it's been doing these kinds of leases for a long time. But we actually learned, I think, for the first time last year and got much more detailed information than we had had previously as to the nature of the leases. And we have actual copies of some of them and other background information about them. We got it last year when we were working on the authorization bill. We haven't changed our theory as to how these things should be scored, but we learned enough about them to learn that they are different than what we had. They had always been called operating leases, and okay, there are ways one treats operating leases. And it was only last year that we realized that they really didn't fall in that category.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I plan to ask more questions in the second round. Thank you.
For the second panel? Second panel. Okay. Gentleman yields back. Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sunshine. I think we are all hoping that you could bring a little bit more sunshine to the problem here, but appreciate your testimony. And I'm just curious within the CBO how a decision like this is made. Is it your decision? Is it a group of experts that get together to evaluate this? Who is the final decision maker?
The final decision maker at CBO is always the director. But the way we do it is we have a staff of very talented analysts, and we have unit chiefs, and we have general counsel, and on difficult, complicated questions, we would probably gather 4 or 5 or 6 people together and exchange emails and have a meeting and discuss exactly what the appropriate approach was. So there were numerous people involved in making this judgment.
So that's what you described as what happened when this bill, you said the last year's bill was the catalyst to all of this. That's what happened.
And a number of those very smart people are here this morning.
Okay. And so you had also mentioned that it's not CBO's role to make recommendations or towards solutions. Strictly, doing what is right from an accounting perspective. So if you're analyzing all of this and looking at it deeply, you also mentioned that you've learned a lot from these leases. You've looked at other agencies and their leases. So you've gathered all of this information, but not necessarily in a position of recommending solutions. Who would we go to recommend solutions? Clearly, the end result of all of this is not a good one because we desperately need the facilities, and we have great demand to provide the health needs for our returning veterans. And so where would we go to get recommendations on this? We know that we can't have the facilities, but the end goal here is to have the facilities.
Yeah. I'm sure that I would imagine the VA has some interesting ideas as to how to approach it. The folks at OMB may have some thoughts, and we're happy to work with the committee and explore if people come up with some ideas that perhaps we haven't thought of, to explore how that would be, what kind of legislation would be necessary and how we would score such legislation. We'd be happy to work with you on that.
So in your opinion, is legislation really the only option here in terms of fixing the problem?
No, I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Okay.
As I said, we've heard mention of the service contract concept, and as I understand it, and I don't have great expertise in this, it's not, my understanding is that the department may not need legislation to do those kinds of things, and if so, then we're really not involved. There's nothing for us to do or say about it.
Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment? Would you yield me a minute? I just want, another question came to mind. What exactly was the new information that you got that made you determine that you had to change the way you did the lease? I mean, didn't you know that it was a 20-year lease before?
No.
So you didn't know that? No. But that's been going on for...
we don't, it's not our role to delve deeply into the intricacies of how agencies operate and what they do. We don't, it's not...
It's not like you changed your role.
And we probably should have known that sooner, but we didn't.
Was that the only piece of information then?
Well, I think we learned not only about the length of the leases, but the nature of the detailed nature of the transactions and how the financing.
Well, what was the nature of the transaction that you learned that made a difference? Pardon me? What was the different, besides the term of the lease, what was the other detailed information?
We got clear information about what the government's payments, what kind of payments the government was making, how much they were, when they had to be made.
You never looked before as to how much the payments were? I'm just trying to find out what exactly that.
That's not really our. If an agency, if a bill says an agency is authorized to enter into operating leases for whatever, unless we learn something else, there's nothing much, and it's subject to appropriations. Then, from our perspective,
the only thing that I got
so what we learned was that they weren't really operating leases.
The only thing I got from this,
gentleman's time has expired. In fairness to the CBO, they were scoring the VA cost of the VA leases based on the information that was given to them at the time. When they were given more information, I think they made a more fulsome decision, made a decision based on more fulsome information. And I think that's the correct characterization of this. I don't think there was any intent to try to hurt the VA by the CBO scoring decision. I just think they had better information. With that, Ms. Brownlee, did you want any more of your time back?
I yield back.
Okay, because he took all of it. I just want to make sure. All right. I've now recognized the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Worlarski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a follow-up question to my colleagues' questions. So on this additional information, is this information that you said you discovered, was this information that the VA just happened to drop and bring to you? Or was this information that you made additional inquiries and the CBO found?
I think we made some inquiries and we got, and I don't know, I think we probably inquired more than perhaps we had, or maybe somebody said something to us when we were talking to them that prompted more questions, and we asked more questions,
Sure.
We got more information. They were very helpful to us in giving us information.
I guess my other question would be, what, in the process of the inquiries, was there any reason given from the VA why that information was never divulged to the CBO before?
We're not an investigatory agency.
Yeah.
So, they were under no obligation to ship over to us copies of their leases. I don't know whether we had asked for them previously and had not gotten them. I haven't gone back in the history to determine what happened in previous years.
Sure, I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll give back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back her time. Ms. Kirkpatrick, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sunshine, in my private law practice over the years, I would review government leases with cities, towns, counties, state government. And because they were subject to appropriations, it was well known that if the appropriations weren't there, the lease would terminate. And there was a clause there that said that, actually, in the lease agreement or the contract. Because they were subject to appropriations. Now that you have looked at these leases and contracts, do they have something similar?
Maybe I'll ask someone who's looked. Anyone know the answer to it? Do they have a contingency in the event that appropriation is not available?
There is a fixed payment required. It comes from a lump sum appropriation. So unless there was no appropriation for VA medical facilities, there would be an appropriation. So it would be difficult to get out of the fixed obligation of the lease, even with that clause, because of the lump sum nature of the appropriation.
Suppose the appropriation is not there. Then what you're saying is then that obligation continues to accrue?
Well, then that would be, I believe that would be paid from the judgment. There was not.
I'm sorry, would you step to the microphone so we can make this part of the record? Let me just explain the principle behind this.
This is David Newman.
Hi, David. Thank you for being here. But the principle behind this is that you can't obligate taxpayer dollars beyond the appropriate appropriation. So I'd like to know, suppose the appropriation is not made, do taxpayer dollars continue to accrue on an obligation that's no longer legal?
I believe it would, that the obligation has been incurred, and if the discretionary appropriation is provided, it would have to come from somewhere. If the facility had been built and the government had committed to making a payment, and it was liquidating that from a discretionary appropriation, but the discretionary appropriation wasn't provided, then the cost of paying that would have to come from somewhere else. I think that would only happen in this case if there were no...
Well, I'm sorry to disagree with you because taxpayer dollars are involved here. And it seems to me that you cannot, this principle that you can obligate taxpayer dollars for the long term when you have nothing in return is just simply not legal. I mean, can you tell me why that is legal? I mean, why would I pay for Tim Waltz's house for 30 years when I have no opportunity to use it?
I mean, that's one of our concerns about the way the transactions are currently being treated, in that there isn't the money provided in appropriations up front to cover the costs, but the government is committed to making those payments and has signed contracts that requires it to make those payments.
Well, then your theory is that the government is guaranteeing the developer that they're going to be able to pay for their development.
Yes.
Can you tell me of any other governmental entity that does that? That actually acts, where the government acts as the loan guarantee for the development?
Well, I think that may well be in cases where the government is actually paying to
purchasing. Let's not mix apples and oranges here. Leases. We're talking about leases where the government at the end of the lease does not own the property. Can you tell me of any other governmental agency that enters into leases or contracts like that where they're obligating taxpayer dollars for something that they're never going to own?
I don't know. We have not explored all the government's leasing practices. The GSA, the General Services Administration, has the authority by law to enter into, I think, 20-year leases without having the money up front.
I understand that. Here's the difference, though. With the other governmental contracts I've looked at, there is a clause so that everybody understands that these are subject to appropriations, to the appropriation budgetary process. And if that doesn't happen, they can be terminated. And I want to know if that clause is in these leases.
Have you seen that clause in the leases?
No, I've seen a requirement to make a series of fixed payments whether the agency occupies the facility or not.
Well, would you do this for me? Go back and look at those, and maybe we can do a follow-up.
You might also, I mean, the folks from VA who are obviously more intimately familiar with the details of leases can probably answer that question as well, but we'd be happy to look into that more.
Well, I just want to tell you, I thank you for being here. I'd like some more investigation into this because I find it very troubling that your policy would commit taxpayer dollars before they're actually appropriated. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Kirkpatrick. I would, for the sake of the order, I'd recommend that you ask that question to the VA, the questions you just asked. Mr. Doggerbauer, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Doggerbauer represents Texas Tech University, who has he and I are working on a joint project that's directly affected by this matter.
Well, Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and on behalf of the veterans all across the country, in particular the veterans in the 19th District, this is a very important hearing, and I'm very proud that you had that, and I appreciate you allowing me to participate in this. Good morning, Mr. Sunshine. How are you? Just a little question, Mr. Sunshine. Did you major in accounting?
No.
Okay. Because I was looking at your resume and I didn't see that anywhere. So you were not an accounting major?
Oh, no. I was math and economics, and I did go to Harvard Business School for a little bit. So.
Yeah. Okay. So are you familiar with GAAP accounting?
A bit.
Huh?
A bit.
A bit.
Yeah, not a lot. I'm not an expert on accounting.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be an expert on government budgeting.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
But you're making a fairly important determination here of what is a purchase and what is a lease, aren't you?
Yes.
And so do you think you're following generally accepted accounting principles on that?
I think we're following the principles of that apply to
No, I didn't ask
federal budgeting.
Yeah, no, well,
But I can't, no, but I can't answer the general accounting.
Okay, so you don't know whether you are or not? Yeah.
No.
Do you think baseline budgeting is a good thing?
I'm not sure what you mean by baseline budgeting.
It's the budgeting we use here in.
I mean, I think we do 10-year projections of what we think the budget would look like if current laws remained in place. I think that's a useful, gives us, and we actually do longer-term projections. I think those are useful to get a sense of what the budgetary situation is.
So some of these proposals that are out there are facilities that had a 20-year lease, and now they're either being rolled over or they're going over to a new facility. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is are we netting then that liability? Because basically, if you go back and treat those leases the way they were if you took that principle and gone back and applied them to those leases, so basically there's a netting here of what the new liability is based on what the previous liability was. Are you taking that into account?
Well, I think the objective of the budget is to take into account new obligations of the government when it enters into them.
Yeah, but you remember that there's an obligation rolling off, and so the question is, are we when you're looking at this, are you netting that out?
Well, I think, for example, that
I'm not asking you what you think. Are you netting it out?
Well, I'm not sure there's a netting that needs to be done.
Well, if you're going to treat,
if the government has already if a facility was built, the government leased it for 20 years, made all its payments, and now is extending the lease for 3 years or 5 years or something like that, then the only question is, what is the new government obligation that is entering into, and is that just an operating lease, or is that something else?
So is a 19-year lease a capital lease?
It could be.
Is an 18?
It could be. I don't know that we don't have a magic formula that
you have some formula.
We try to look at the substance of the underlying substance of the transactions.
Yeah.
I think.
So here's another question. So if I have a 5-year lease with 3 options for 5 years, is that a purchase lease or is that an operating lease?
I think I think if the 5-year lease doesn't involve payment for most of the cost of the building in the first 5 years, then it's probably an operating lease.
So if you have a 5-year with 3 5-year options, that would be a operating lease under where you treat that.
I think that would probably be true.
So what about if they had a 10-year with one 10-year option?
I'm sorry, 2-year with
a 10-year and then another 10-year option if the VA chose.
I think it would not be wise for me to try to delineate very specific numbers and combinations, because there are infinite numbers of combinations, and we'd be happy to look at specific kinds of proposals. But as I said, we don't have a specific formula that says X number of years with X number of options is an operating lease, and Y number of years is essentially a purchase. We try to look at the substance and the nature of the transactions and the nature of the government's financial commitment.
Yeah, but the IRS doesn't treat a 20-year lease as a purchase.
Pardon me?
The IRS doesn't treat a 20-year lease as a purchase. So I think the concern here with all of us is that there's huge inconsistency here, and unfortunately, the people that are going to pay the ultimate price here are the veterans of this country, which to me is a great injustice. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, gentlemen's time has expired. Mr. Walsh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. I think my colleagues are highlighting what I see to be a pattern of happening. You mentioned there's a lot of smart people at CBO. I won't deny that. Were any of them elected by the people? Anyone at CBO elected by the people?
Not a one.
Anyone have statutory authority to write law?
Not a one.
Anyone have statutory authority to interpret law?
Statutory
To interpret laws?
Well, we interpret law all the time in terms of estimating budgetary things, but
And that has
we're not courts.
You're not the courts. All right. The reason I ask this is I'm going to bring up a little story here. On your website, it says analysts write quick turnaround cost estimates for legislation that's headed to the floor for a vote. Mr. Denham and I have a piece of legislation, H.R. 975, that we've been working on for years. 4 years. The committee has requested a score on the bill. We've requested a score on the bill. We requested it again because we knew the NDAA was coming up. I went out and built a coalition amongst Democrats and Republicans. It's supported by most major veteran service organizations. It's to correct a wrong of 31,000 veterans who were discharged. Some like Liz Loris, who had 3 rapes against her, was discharged from the military with a personality disorder. We're trying to correct that wrong. And I was brought, the speaker allowed it to come up there. I went up to the Rules Committee, and it was thrown out. You know why it was thrown out? Can you make a guess, Mr. Sunshine? You know why it's
You're
thrown out?
probably going to tell me because it didn't have a CBO cost.
That's correct. It didn't have a score. Not only did it not have a score, someone made the interpretation, someone who's not elected, and I don't know their name, and I went to Chadron State, not Harvard, but I know that they made a determination that did not allow that thing to be heard because they said there will be a cost associated. Every other expert said there would not be in this, so it was nixed from coming to the floor. Now, my question is, I certainly value the work that CBO does. It is important for us to get this right. But it appeared to me like an arbitrary decision was made with no evidence of why it was made, who made it, or what it was being determined on, crushed a bill that had its one opportunity to go forward. Thousands of veterans were not only denied their rights, they were denied the right to be heard. It's not your determination whether the law was good, bad, or indifferent, but because of that decision, the hands of the majority were tied because they said there would be a cost associated. I still don't know what that cost will be. No one has given it to me. Apparently, I can only see that it was not prioritized on there. So now we hear it with the leases. I've got a CBOC I've been waiting 4 years for in Albert Lea, Minnesota. The city council down there just appropriated $50,000 of tax dollars, hard-earned tax dollars, to try and speed this process up. And now what I'm going to go back and tell them is I'm not sure. Somebody who knows more than us made this decision. So how would you respond? And I got to be honest with you. I try, and I've said in here for years, try and be as fair as possible. This fire that's lit under me is a bonfire now of the arbitrariness of this decision, and I see it starting to seep into others. Assure me that that's not the case. Tell me how H.R. 975 wasn't heard. Can you tell me that?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the details of the specific bill. I know that, for example, when bills are being considered or amendments are being considered by the Rules Committee, we often get calls and...
This is a standalone bill I requested months ago.
I mean, we do not have the resources or the staff to cost out every single bill. What we do is we take guidance from committee chairmen and ranking members and give priority to those requests. So I can't, I don't know what happened with it.
Both of them are
co-sponsors. But I'd be
co-sponsored.
happy to look into it some more and be happy to explain to you exactly what our analysis was and what we concluded.
What are our recourse? What is my recourse to go back to say how this could be fixed? I don't understand how someone I don't know, sitting in an office I don't know where it's at, can trump the will of 650,000 Southern Minnesotans, thousands of veterans, veteran service organizations, the chairman, the ranking member. How can that happen?
We'd be happy to. I mean, our job is to tell you and your colleagues what we think the budgetary impact of legislation is. We do the best we can. We get as much information as we can. We often don't have much time to do it, and we make those judgments. If you think we made a bad judgment, then we ought to talk some more about it. You or your staff should, you can call Doug or myself, and Doug Elmendorf or myself, or your staff can call, and let's go over it.
I tried that, but I know now if I come and I make a stink about it, someone gets me. That is wrong. That is wrong. I am trying to do, and I do not know what this lease situation is. I do not know how this decision was made. I still have sat here and listened for an hour. I have no clue, and I listened to Mr. Nagerbauer's questions. I didn't think I got an answer there, how that was being done, and I'm just at a loss, and I think it's really unfortunate because I do believe in the work you do. It's important, but I think we've got a problem of trust that is building. I would say not building, it is festering. You've done something amazing here. You've united Republicans and Democrats, so.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Sunshine, thank you for your testimony today. You're now excused.
Thank you.
I would now like to invite our second and final panel to the witness table. Joining us today from the VA is the Honorable Dr. Robert A. Petzel, Undersecretary for Health. Dr. Petzel is accompanied by Mr. Philip Matofsky, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health and Administrative Operations, and Mr. Jim Sullivan, Director of the Office of Enterprise Management. Thank all of you for being here this morning, and you may proceed with your testimony after you get seated. What's that? Oh. Our primary witness will be back in a moment, so we Dr. Petzel, thank you and your team for joining us today. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Michaud, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide provide information about VA's major medical facility and lease program that supports VA's mission to provide quality and accessible health care to America's veterans. I'm accompanied today by Mr. Philip Matkowski, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Administrative Operations, and Mr. James Sullivan, Director of the Office of Asset Enterprise Management. At VA, we must anticipate and meet the needs of current and newly returning veterans. We have many entry points for VHA healthcare, and they include 152 medical centers, 821 community-based outpatient clinics, 300 vet centers, and 70 mobile vet vans. In response to increased demand, VA has enhanced its capacity to deliver needed care so that veterans can more readily access their care. We acknowledge a growing list of facility replacement and modernization projects. However, our greatest immediate concern is the unexpected development last September on the proposed capital lease budgetary scoring for all future VA major medical leases. This threatens to disrupt one of our most important and fundamental tools to deploy medical care for veterans. The goal of VA's capital asset and leasing program is to ensure that there are safe, secure, state-of-the-art facilities to provide benefits and services to our nation's veterans. VA owns and leases real property in hundreds of communities across the U.S. and overseas. VA has developed and continues to look for sound capital asset management strategies to assist in maximizing the value of its portfolio. Beginning with the fiscal year 2012 budget, VA introduced the SCIP, C-I-P process to prioritize all capital investments based on identified mission needs. The SCIP process is a requirement-based planning and gathering tool which is used by the Department to address the most critical needs first. VA has a complete picture of need and a prioritized list of future capital investments. In addition to construction, the leasing of medical facilities is essential to providing veterans with accessible health care services. Leasing provides VA the flexibility to respond to demographic shifts, changing service demands, and improvements in technology to support projected outpatient workload increases and the addition of services. As you are aware, the Congressional Budget Office is now recommending a change in the scoring of VA's major medical lease authorizations. This change precludes VA from procuring 27 medical facility leases serving more than 340,000 veterans in 20 states in FY13 and 14, and it jeopardizes all future 600 leases that VA presently has. In this situation, if this situation persists, it will negatively affect veterans. Without a resolution, 6 existing clinics may have to close, 14 will have to be constrained to already overpopulated facilities, and long-planned and budgeted expansions will not move forward. There will be increased travel and increased wait times for veterans, especially those people who live in rural areas where access to health care is limited at best. VA continues to look for ways to enhance collaborations with DoD and other federal agencies. VA-DoD partnerships deliver benefits and services to veterans, service members, military retirees, and other beneficiaries across the country. VA and DoD have direct sharing agreements between VA medical centers and military treatment facilities for a range of services. In FY 2012, there are 230 direct sharing agreements between 61 medical centers and 105 DoD medical treatment facilities. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate the opportunity to address these important issues. VA must ensure that veterans and other eligible beneficiaries receive timely, accessible, veteran-centric, high-quality medical care. While we have a portfolio of healthcare delivery options, one key option is leasing. If the major medical facility leasing issues are not expeditiously resolved, I fear it will have a significant negative impact on VA's primary health care, mental health care, and specialty services for veterans. We need your support in resolving this challenge as we continue to care for America's veterans. VA is committed to providing the high-quality care that our veterans have earned and deserved, and my colleagues and I are pleased to respond to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Petzold. I now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. In your written testimony, you state that, quote, "Our greatest immediate concern is how applying capital lease budgetary scoring to all proposed VA medical facility leases threatens to potentially disrupt our ability to deploy state-of-the-art medical care for veterans," unquote. And it's been almost a year since this issue came to light. And in that intervening time, what proactive steps has the VA taken to pursue workarounds or alternatives that will ensure that the department is able to meet the care needs of our veterans?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first and foremost is the best solution to this problem is to find a way to continue the leasing program without having to appropriate the full 20 years of cost of the lease in the year of approval. That is unquestionably the solution we seek and that we wish to work with you in order to obtain. We have looked at contracting. We've looked at fee basis, which are the two obvious possibilities. And if time permits, I can elaborate on the difficulties that we see with those. But primarily, they're out-of-network care. They're care outside of the VA network. And they're care that, in our experience, has been uniformly more expensive than doing the care within the VA. And third is that it's often difficult to find people that are willing to contract for that kind of extensive care. So the best solution from our perspective is to work with Congress to find a way to deal directly with the leasing issue. The other alternatives, such as contracting, fee basis, sharing with DoD and with other government agencies, all we think falls short of that initial solution.
One of the areas that's going to be impacted the most, and this is what VA has argued in the past, is that rural areas will be most impacted by the CBA's scoring methodology. And so the question is this: what is the role of a fee-based care for rural areas? And I think I heard you argue a little bit both ways on that particular point. What's the real downside to fee-based care in a rural area?
I would argue that there isn't necessarily a downside issue in rural areas for fee-based care. Fee-based care, the intent of that legislation is to provide for periodic care. Fee-based care is not viewed and was not intended to be something that's used to provide for the full spectrum, primary care, specialty care, et cetera. It's supposed to be a stopgap when you can't get the services that you need, particularly specialty care. We use it, and we do use it in rural areas. If someone needs a cardiology consult and they live in a small town in Montana, we will contract on a fee basis with the cardiologist in that community if it's available, so that somebody doesn't have to travel 300 miles to Billings. So we do use it, and it's very effective in the rural areas. Many of these clinics, however, are not just in rural areas. They're serving large numbers of people, and it would be impractical to use fee-basis care in that instance.
Continue on the question of fee-based care for a minute. Is the VA, I mean, excluding the centers of excellence where the VA is really good, I mean, PTSD, TBI, crush injuries, things like that, has the VA ever done a full cost study of comparing if we treat a veteran on a fee-for-service basis through a third-party provider on one hand versus the fully loaded cost of the care in a VA facility, including the cost of the overhead, the facility, the capital cost, and so forth? Have you ever done a full comparison to see which provides the better care for the veteran and also provides the most effective arrangement for the taxpayers?
Mr. Chairman, with each one of these community-based outpatient clinic proposals, we require a business case be developed to look at all of the options, which would include contracting, which would include building a VA-owned and operated clinic, and which would include leasing as well. So we do, yes, with every one of these clinics, look at the options from the point of view of what's the best business case.
Okay, my time has almost expired. I'm going to yield to Mr. Michaud for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my question, is there anyone from CBO still left in the audience? I think it shows how much interest they really have in this issue. Thank you, Dr. Petzl, for coming here in the panel. My first question would be, would it be a viable alternative solution to adopting GSA's approach to leases and create a program similar to the Federal Building Fund, where income derived from agency rental assessments would provide for a more predictable source of revenue for new construction and capital improvements?
I'm going to turn to Mr. Sullivan to comment directly on the GSA process, which I am not as familiar with as he is. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We believe that there is the potential, and it's an option that should and could be explored. To date, we haven't, but we know their leasing program does not have the same issues that we have here in terms of congressional authorization. So that would be something I think that could be explored as a potential option or solution that we could learn something from and maybe use a portion of that as we try and find a way to deal with this.
Thank you. And during your discussions with CBO, have they offered any type of solutions as far as what you can do differently with your leases that would make it palatable so you don't have to have that money all up front?
Basically, no, sir. They have not offered particular solutions. They have told us what the rules are or what their recommendations are. Remember, their opinions are advisory. They are advice. They're not. They don't carry the force of law or rule. And they have just presented us with, this is the way we're going to score this. This is what our view is of how this should be looked at from a financial point of view. We have gotten no help, particularly in other alternatives.
We heard this morning from CBO, they're saying because they looked at the leases, more in depth, and that's why they made their determination. Has VA instituted a policy change in how you execute the major medical facility leases in the past 5 years, or has it pretty much been consistent? It's just that they're looking at it differently?
Congressman Michaud, we have operated under the same set of rules for 21 years. These leases have been scored for the past 21 years by CBO. They have been approved by Congress for the last 21 years with the same set of rules that we have now. There has been no change.
Are you aware of any other federal agencies that's in a similar situation that the department's in, where the CBO is not treating them the same as they are the Department of Veterans Administration?
I'm going to turn that question over to Mr. Sullivan, but my knowledge is no, there is no one else.
My understanding is there is not any other agency in town that has to go through this type of a authorization process. So there would not be a role for CBO in any of those other agencies. And I think CBO alluded to that earlier this morning, that this was the only one they were aware of as well.
If a resolution cannot be agreed upon, what contingency plan has the Department of Veterans Administration looked at to ensure that veterans' health care is not adversely impacted by the change in the scoring policy of the leases?
Well, first of all, let me say, Congressman Michaud, that I believe that working with OMB, working with Congress, that we will find a solution. If that contingency should not be met, as mentioned earlier, the things that we have looked at are, number one, maintaining services as they are now. There are many of these leases that could be renewed without having to be scored as a capital lease, or at least some of them. We would look to see if it was a viable alternative to contract, and I want to just go through what the difficulties are with contracting for care. It's out of plan care. So they're not in our system. They're not subjected to and involved in the same kinds of high quality care that we are. They don't have the same quality assurance programs that we do, although we can compel some of that in a contract. And they're not in the business of taking care of veterans, which does indeed make a difference, particularly when it comes to mental health and such things as PTSD and depression.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good luck with working with the CBO. The fact that no one stayed to hear what this panel was going to present really is troubling to me, because it shows that, quite frankly, in my opinion, that they don't care, and they're off doing their other things. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Gentleman's time is expired. Mr. Benachek, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Dr. Petzel, I know that you're very disappointed over all this action here with the CBO, and I was somewhat amazed by the testimony as well. Even the Nagelbauer's question about what is the rule then? It seemed to be it's sort of arbitrary, because he couldn't come up with actual rules. So it's going to be very difficult to create a lease that would meet their rules, since that they couldn't give you an example of what rule would do it. So I can really understand the difficulty in going forward. Is there a worst case scenario about this? I mean, and would it be different? I'll go just answer that question. What is the worst case scenario here?
Let me just make a comment first, Dr. Benachek, harkening back to your questions with the CBO. I share your chagrin and amazement at the fact that this is considered to be a purchase. This is something that we just have not been able to get our hands around, because we don't own any of these clinics when we're funded. We've had run through the entire leases in many instances, and we don't own anything when we get finished.
Right.
We're not buying a clinic.
Well, no, I was amazed by his testimony that defining a lease as a purchase, where I don't see that in the CBO's realm of decision making.
The worst case it really has to be described, I think, almost clinic by clinic. There are some clinics that will close, and that means that care is going to have to go back either to other clinics or into the medical center, or we'll have to purchase the care in the community. There are other clinics who will continue to operate, but they're not going to be expanded. They're oversubscribed as it is, and the space is much inadequate, and those clinics will have to continue to function with what they have.
You do have some outside providers providing, like CBOC clinic.
We do. We have about 20% of our community-based outpatient clinics are what we call contract. They're almost all of them in small communities. My experience when I was the network director in Minneapolis, we have 3 small contract community-based outpatient clinics where it wasn't practical for us. There's one patient panel, so we need one primary care provider and the support people. And when we staff that, we run the risk of somebody leaving and not being able to provide the care. When we contract for that, the contractor's obligation is to provide us with an individual. So yes, again, they're mostly small, but we do 20% of our clinics are contract.
Well, is that a possibility for, would a contract require upfront appropriations?
No.
Other than,
no,
rather
sir.
than a lease? I mean, that's the question I come up with.
They would not require upfront appropriations. The difficulty with contract in situations other than these small clinics is cost, is finding enough competition in the community so that we can get a good price. When you're dealing with only one provider, as an example in the community, you're really at their mercy in terms of how much it would cost. So in these large areas, and Congressman Bill Raucus's clinic is an example of a pretty populous area where we're trying to consolidate a group of CBOCs, the contract would not be practical, we think, in that particular circumstance. But in some of them, it would be.
Well, I'm just trying to think of ways to deal with this issue, and I'm not sure how it's going to be dealt with at the congressional side, but do you have any other ideas, a way to get around this apparent, other than reforming the Congressional Budget Office, which...
Well, I think that they're working with OMB and with the Congress. There may be a way of relooking at the whole leasing structure legislatively. I think the best possibility for the longer term lies in doing that, to look at how do we want to, as a government, how do we want to approach this process so that it is safeguarded, but it's doable. I think that's the long-term solution, sir.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rourke, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to echo the ranking member's frustration with the fact that the CBO did not remain to hear your testimony and to listen to our questions as we try to find out how we're going to do the best we can possibly under these circumstances, or possibly change these circumstances to serve those veterans in our communities. It doesn't build goodwill, it doesn't build trust, it doesn't build greater understanding, and it doesn't help us form the basis for a positive resolution to this problem. With that being said, I want to understand more from your perspective the legitimacy of this ruling, or illegitimacy of this ruling that the CBO has made. And I'm still trying to get to an apples to apples comparison. When the DoD builds a facility, or HHS or IRS or Social Security, from what you and the CBO have said, they do not require legislation to do that, and that's the key difference between the VA and these other departments and agencies?
They do not require congressional authorization.
Congressional authorization.
That is what I understand to be the key difference.
And
Authorization of individual leases. I believe that program is authorized, but I don't think there's an individual.
Can you turn your mic on?
Sorry. Congressman, there is not an individual authorization of individual leases.
Okay. And why is that unique to the VA? Why does that situation exist?
Mr. Matkowski.
It's in our statute. It's in Title 38, Section 8104. Explicitly calls out our requirement for leases above a certain threshold. It used to be 300,000, then it was raised to 600,000. It was recently raised to $1 million. That for those leases, that subset, we require explicit congressional authorization.
And what was the intent behind that unique requirement for the VA?
I don't know. It's been around for decades.
Right. The requirement prior to that was a committee resolution by this committee that would authorize the leases just at the committee level, and there was no statutory authorization. I think back in 1991 that was changed to have a specific statutory authorization, and I can't comment on the rationale for that at the time.
Yeah. And I wonder, following this hearing, if you could help us find the legislative intent behind that and what they were hoping to achieve. Again, unique as compared to other departments and agencies. And again, to hopefully use our specific case in El Paso to illustrate the larger issue. You heard me say earlier the population of veterans that we're trying to serve through a clinic today that's co-located with a DoD facility at Fort Bliss, which ultimately means that many veterans, far too many, have to travel far too many hours to get care at a full-service VA facility in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we're urgently exploring options to build a full-service acute care facility in the El Paso region to serve those 80,000 plus veterans. With this ruling, or with the terms as you understand them today, I'd like to know what our options are. You know, we have a brand new DoD facility being built, a full-service active duty facility being built at Fort Bliss East, which will vacate the existing active duty hospital. And then we also have an opportunity with a state university to co-locate. So in those three scenarios, does this ruling prohibit the VA from moving forward with a full-service veterans hospital in that region? And obviously your answer would apply to all other regions that face those same options.
Yeah, I'm familiar, Congressman, with the discussions and plans about El Paso. It doesn't involve any leasing, and what we're discussing here should not have any impact on what's going on in El Paso.
So even in that third scenario of partnering with a state university, if we enter into an agreement, if the VA enters into an agreement with the state university to build to suit a facility that will serve veterans, it seems like we get into some of this scoring quandary, and I want to know how that may be different than other scenarios that have been raised today.
It might. The difference often is that the land would be donated, and that may or may not involve leasing. I think we'd have to look very carefully and specifically at that, and I wasn't familiar with that particular scenario. But in terms of our general approach to El Paso, as I understand it now, it should not.
Great. I look forward to resolving this issue with you. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Pretzel, for your testimony. I also express a lot of frustration. The CBO is not here. That means they're not serious about the issue. We need to do everything we can for our true American heroes. Very disappointed that they're not here. The challenges that have been laid out so far are very troubling, Doctor, especially with regards to the 27 leases that are currently pending. I know that my colleagues and I will continue to work. This is a top priority for us to find a solution in order to ensure that our veterans continue to receive the high-quality care that they're currently receiving, and they certainly deserve. As you know, the VA recently approved a plan in my district, you referred to it, Doctor, that would take 5 existing clinics and consolidate them into one large facility, which would be wonderful. This would allow them to better meet the growing needs of my veterans community with its diverse health status. My intention is to do everything I can to allow this building to go forward. We've talked about this, Doctor, and I've also talked to the director at Haley, and things are looking really good that we can renegotiate and extend for the future. But we must stay on this. Now I'd like to focus on the 5 existing leases. Could you please elaborate on the VA's option for maintaining the C-Box in my district and in others too? Can you speak? We seem to be in pretty good shape, but what about the others? And do you have the legal authority without congressional authorization to extend the existing leases?
Because I'll briefly answer that, and then I'm going to turn to Mr. Metkowski and Mr. Sullivan for the details. But some of these leases can be extended, most of them cannot. Again, as I was saying earlier in answering your question,
excuse me, why can they not be extended?
If they require, if the extension of them required authorization, et cetera, we would have difficulty doing it. But Mr. Metkowski.
Congressman Bilirakis, I don't know the exact number of leases in your district, but in Visinade in Florida, there are 122 leases that are below the $300,000 annual rent amount. All of those can be, renewed, extended, competed, recompeted, et cetera, because they're not above the, pardon me, they're not above the authorization threshold. It's those that are above the authorization threshold. So for Newport Richey, the consolidation wouldn't be able to move forward, and you would still have the disparate leases that exist today. That's not optimal. Referrals require somebody to get in their car and drive far away. Those smaller leases, though, would still continue.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I understand. The 5 existing leases should be fine. But we've got to get this done. As you said, Doctor, the contracting is not an option in my area, in most areas. So thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you. And we've got to get it done, and I know it's a priority of this committee. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Greg McLeod, did you have any questions?
I think my only question is this hearing so we could find a solution. Is this what we're here for?
Hopefully. So, gentlelady yields back. Dr. Rowe, you're recognized for.
I thank the chairman for yielding, and a couple of things. Dr. Petzel knows this, but one of the ways we solved the lease problem in Sevierville, Tennessee, was you have a $1 a year lease. That was pretty cheap. Even I can afford that. So I think you can. If we got more of those, it wouldn't be an issue. I'd like to know how we get around and fix this, why the VA, and I suspect it happened, and Mr. O'Rourke's question was very good about how this came to pass. There may have been some leases that were not good that the VA had in the past, and the committee I don't know. We'll find out what that is and why it was done that way. But the VA has to be able to do these leases to carry on its mission. I mean, you can't do it. In other words, you've just heard how disruptive it is for patient care. So we have to fix this. It's not an option. And I agree with the ranking member, to have the people who score this to not even be here is shameful. To hear the concerns that we have. One of the questions, and back to what the chairman was speaking to when I first came in, was when you look at the cost of care that's contracted out, and what he was asking, I think, was if you look at, let's say, an orthopedic procedure at a VA, we never seem to look at all the cost of the hospital, the nurses, all of that. That's got to be. Is it cheaper? I think he was asking, and correct me if I'm wrong. Would it be cheaper in some cases to have someone just perform that service outside the VA? Would that be less expensive? And certainly I know you do that, and we're probably doing that at home right now because our orthopedics is backed up so far that veterans are having to wait an inordinate amount of time. Is it cheaper if you amortize everything just to say, okay, we'll just pay this much, because you're being able now to, with the new ACOs and so forth, to get some really good bundled prices on what it would cost you to have a hip replacement, let's say, or a knee replacement?
Dr. Rowe, thank you. That's an excellent question. The studies that I am most familiar with were done comparing Medicare costs to VA costs, sort of specific procedure by specific procedure. And in those instances, they did amortize the VA's buildings, et cetera, in the same fashion that a private sector hospital or clinic might be doing that. And what they found, and that would have been probably the least costly way to do it in the private sector, was about an 18% reduction in cost in the VA. So it was cheaper. And the comparisons, as you point out, are very difficult. Yeah. It's just very hard to get everybody to agree, yes, this methodology compares apples and apples. Our experience is that when we go out and contract for care, that the cost is higher than when we provide it. But there are circumstances where it's important for us to do that. If we only need to have 5 or 6 orthopedic procedures a year, hip replacements, we don't want an orthopedic surgeon in the facility that we're paying for that isn't kept as busy as they need to be. And we would buy that service on the outside, even though procedure by procedure it might be more expensive. That's a cost-effective thing to do. On the other hand, if we have enough business to keep an orthopedic surgeon appropriately busy, we probably can do those things at a less costly way.
I think there are a lot of new opportunities out there, new models that are being created now with the just being forced with the way the Affordable Care Act is paying. reimbursing, there would be some opportunities out there. Maybe not right now, but I think in the future, I know that there are plenty of places now that are bundling everything. I mean, it's the hospital, the doctor, the whole shebang, and here you write it one check, and that's what the cost is going to be. I think the VA could look at that.
Oh, we will. Absolutely, sir, we will.
And what, before my time runs out, what exactly, Dr. Petzel, would you say that we need, as a committee, we need to do to help rectify this? Because it can't go forward the way it is.
I think that we need to get together with you, with OMB perhaps, and figure out whether there is a fix legislatively that would give you the oversight that you need of the clinic process, yet allow us to continue doing business as we have. The idea of having to provide for 20 years of funding in the year that there's approval
makes no sense.
It's not viable.
Well, I mean, I looked at a lease. We leased our office, but my Lord, if I had to put up 20, I couldn't have done it. I mean, I couldn't have run a clinic. So, no business in the world does that.
So we need to find a solution that I think allows us to continue with the appropriate amount of money in the year of approval and appropriation without having to come up with the 20 years, because that's just, the resources aren't there.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I think that hits the nail on the head right there.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Yield back the rest of your time. Just for clarification, I didn't say the cheapest care. I said the best care at the fairest for veterans at the fairest price for the taxpayer. Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Petzel. And I was curious to know that if you're, leasing a clinic and you have to later sort of recalibrate based on demands, and you might need more clinics in one area and less in another, just given where the demand is. What happens when you walk away from a clinic like that? I mean, you lease it to build it, and if you walked away from it, then what happens?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Mr. Sullivan, I think, can address that directly.
Sure, we can address that. Our leases at the end of the lease term, we do not own it, we walk away. And I know that's been a concern. In recent history, we looked, CBO raised this issue saying, when you walk away, no one can use it. We did a little research, granted not exhaustive, and looked at 3 places where, in fact, VA walked away, and those facilities have been repurposed. One of them in Las Vegas for 160,000 square feet is now the home corporate for Cox Communications cable company. We also did one in Evansville, Indiana, where we moved into a new clinic. The old one was there, about 30,000 square feet. A nonprofit social service organization uses it now as their headquarters. Lufkin, Texas, same thing. That one was purchased and used by a private practice, medical practice, and used it as an office building. So in many cases, there is life after VA for these facilities. And I think that's somewhat common in leasing. Not in every case, but in many cases.
So is it the VA's responsibility then, when you decide that that facility is one that you no longer need? Is it your responsibility then to find a user and for that facility and negotiate that process, or?
No, that's one of the positives of leasing. Once we are finished with it, we can move on to a new clinic that could be updated for workload and for technology changes, and that old clinic then becomes the private entity who owned its responsibility to do whatever he or she may want with. So we don't have that obligation to have to take that on, and that's one of the beauties of leasing. It allows us, I think Dr. Petzel said earlier, our key word for leasing is flexibility. In leasing, we're allowed to walk away at the end. We're allowed to shift them if veterans services are needed in a slightly different area. We can move to the next lease, or we can expand or contract leases if the veteran demand changes. So that flexibility, we think, is absolutely critical in our asset management approach and our approach to providing the most up-to-date services for veterans in the right place.
Thank you. And Dr. Petzel, I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on, the fact that these 11 facilities weren't created last year, and the other prioritized facilities that you have from your skip list is not getting done. And can you just elaborate a little bit more on what what the impact is on our veterans who, because we're not getting these facilities at this particular moment? Can you just tell us what that really means?
Well, I can speak to, Congressman, I can speak to it broadly. It really is a very specific clinic-by-clinic kind of operation, but
I know, my line of vision is blocked. Sorry.
Generically, number one, it's access. That the veterans just will not have the same kind of access to both primary care and specialty care that they had before. Two, that means travel time. That means that they're going to have to travel greater distance. Our standard is 30 minutes drive time to primary care, and in 2009, that was 75% of our patients had 30-minute access. They now have 85% of our patients have 30-minute drive time access. That's going to deteriorate, and no question about it. The impact, perhaps, of these 27 is not going to be huge, but as this process snowballs, it'll have a significant impact on access, and will have a significant impact, we think, on wait times, because we're going to have to put these patients into already overcrowded other venues.
Thank you. I know in my district, in talking to the veterans, travel time is a major issue. I'm not quite sure how you evaluate 30-minute travel time, because in my district, travel time, it might be 10 miles, but it could be 2 hours worth of travel time. So it's typically a, very early to late in the evening through heavy traffic is a full day for a veteran, just to have maybe a 30-minute appointment.
Well, Congresswoman, that's a very good point, because this is not an issue just in rural America. This is an issue in urban America. Traveling across a metropolitan area like Minneapolis, where I'm familiar, from the northwest corner of Minneapolis down to the southeast corner where the hospital is, people that are 85 years old don't want to take that drive. They're intimidated, in fact, by the urban traffic. So you're absolutely right. It is not just distance.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Nargabarry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Petzl, it's certainly good to see you again, and I want to thank you for including the Lubbock Community Based Outpatient Clinic in your FY14 submission. As you know, the lease is about to expire on the existing facility there, and business unfortunately and unfortunately is growing, and I think the projection is that in that area that be a 50% increase over the next 20 years. One of the things that you and I have discussed in the past is some of the pluses and minuses of co-locating with a major medical school. To get your thoughts on why that's a positive.
Thank you, Congressman, and I do recollect the discussions we had. I appreciate that. A number of things. One is that it allows for the participation of the VA in the teaching programs of the university, and we believe that clinical care is enhanced when you have students that are being taught when you're doing research in and around that facility. Number two is it's the access to specialty care. You have a university hospital or a university affiliated hospital right there proximate to the VA clinic, and being able to purchase on fee basis or contract the things that you can't provide in that clinic are much easier under the circumstances of affiliation. It's a very positive thing from us. It is one of the ingredients that's responsible for the VA having evolved into this excellent healthcare system.
And one of the other things that is making sure that you all have the flexibility of doing some leasing and some of shared space and joint use, because one of the things that's going to be important as we move forward is we've got all these baby boomers, we've got all of these veterans, is controlling the cost for healthcare, providing that. So I think the Texas Tech proposal, for example, they're bringing some other participants, the county hospital, and looking at ways to share and co-utilize some of the facilities there. Isn't that really the wave of the future, and something that you need the flexibility to work out and negotiate on behalf of veterans?
Yes, Congressman, we do need the flexibility to do that. In circumstances like we have in Lubbock, It's close to an ideal circumstance and situations. We don't have that everywhere, but where we do, we need the flexibility to be able to take advantage of it. Yes.
And I think that the CBOC concept, I mean, one of the things we know is that we deliver health care much differently than we did even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And things that we used to have to go to the hospital for, today we can do in many of the cases on an outpatient basis. And I have a congressional district that has almost 30,000 square miles in it, and we have a lot of veterans, and these community-based clinics are extremely important to those veterans that utilize those. Otherwise, as you say, have to drive long distances, and it's not just the fact that they have to drive long distances; is they have to they're longer distances away from their support system of the people that are going to take care of them after they've had a procedure or some care in that CBOC. So I think that's an important part of that. Well, I know that that this joint use and sharing concept is something that Texas Tech is working extremely hard on, and one of the things we hope that we'll be able to do here is to be able to lower the cost of the VA being able to have an access to a much larger infrastructure than it would have if it was just on a standalone basis. But I look forward to working with the chairman on ways that we can kind of jump over this little hurdle here, because one of the things that I think almost by de facto, if we can't work through this, you're going to be basically getting into the fee business of outsourcing a lot of the care that we've been doing in these clinics, and as you say, in some cases maybe that's not necessarily in the veterans' best interest, and it may not be in the taxpayers' best interest. And so I look forward to working with you and the chairman on this very, very important issue.
Will the gentleman yield the remainder of his time to me?
I would.
Thank you, Mr. Nuckerberry. Dr. Petzel, one of the things I was going to ask you, if you would look at the Lubbock facility and see what legislative adjustments would need to be made in order to be able to cause that facility to be approved, or so that we could go forward with it. If you'll let us know supplementally. We're going to give you a bunch of questions following this hearing, and we'd ask for you to include that among those things to answer.
We will do that, Mr. Chairman.
Now yield to Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes.
Thank you again. Thanks to the chairman and ranking member. I would just make a friendly suggestion. Perhaps we could invite CBO back for an extended time to talk to us again. I am just baffled in the last 50 minutes that someone's not watching TV and sent someone scurrying over here, but it reinforces my opinion, I think. Dr. Petzel, thank you, as always. Thanks for being here, and I, too, am a fan, like many of my colleagues, especially from rural areas. The CBOC concept is working, and again, I think there's a mature attitude here that it's not an all or nothing, that in some cases contracts work well, in others they do not. And in my district, I have one that is a VA-run facility and another that Sterling Medical is doing, and they're providing excellent care, and I'm appreciative of that. Two specific questions on here. Since I've been in Congress, the Southern Minnesota, Northern Iowa clinic was going to be approved next week. That's been 6 years that next week is going to be approved. Is this whole process interfering with the completion of that contract and the completion of that clinic for rural veterans in Southern Minnesota, Northern Iowa?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Wallace. As near as I can tell, no. It's on the approved list for 13, as I understand it already, and I think it's slated to be open sometime in 13 or early 14, so it shouldn't.
All right. I'm excited about that. But I don't often get a quote President Reagan, trust but verify. I'll see this one. So,
and I'm going to do that, sir.
Open that thing. It's a good one. But my other question is this, and I'm hearing from my folks back home, Secretary Shelito and Commissioner Shelito and others. Is this problem forcing you to reprogram? And I bring this up specifically on an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, the stand downs. And you guys have been fabulous partners in communities on stand downs. This year, out of the blue, Minneapolis VA is no longer supporting stand downs, and that created a gap. Our question is, and there's a lot of hurt feelings over this, as you might imagine, and these are long-term partnerships for good causes. Is it your interpretation, Dr. Petzel, that reprogramming because of some of these decisions on leases is starting to have an effect there?
No, sir. There has been no discussion about reprogramming in relationship to this lease issue, and I am chagrined to hear that Minneapolis is not supporting stand-down. We will look into that.
I appreciate that. And again, I thank you, Chairman. This is a very timely hearing, and I think we're starting to get at the heart of some of the problems.
Gentleman yields back. Dr. Petzel, thank you. Mr. Murtovsky, thank you. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for joining us today. You're now excused. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. I would like to once again thank all of our witnesses and audience members for joining us in today's conversation. This hearing is now adjourned.